Welcome to another episode of the Animal Liberation Hour, where we seek insight from animal rights and liberation activists around the world so that we can think, reflect, learn, and be inspired. We're going to be talking a lot about Marius Mason, who is still serving time in prison for underground actions, including burning down a lab at Michigan State, as well as releasing animals from fur farms and destroying logging equipment that was going to wreak havoc on the environment. Letha Muth-Kimball was so nice to come on and not only represent Marius, but also answer some questions about what it's like to do prisoner support work for anybody who's interested in doing that kind of activism. So I hope you'll stick around and hear about that. Before we get into this episode, I want to remind you that the Animal Liberation Hour is a project of Animal Activism Mentorship. AAM is a free multinational program that helps aspiring animal rights activists, as well as those who are already activists but want to take their activism to the next level. From one-on-one mentorship to free workshops and trainings to this podcast, AAM seeks to empower humans to fight for animals so that the world will have more activists and we can achieve liberation sooner. For more information, visit animalactivismmentorship.com and follow AAM on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship. You can keep up with the Animal Liberation Hour on AAM's social media too. Animal Activism Mentorship is fueled by Farm Animal Rights Movement. Enjoy this episode. So welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Animal Liberation Hour. I'm really excited about our guest today. We have Letha here. How are you doing today?
I am good.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. We're going to talk a lot about your friend, political prisoner Marius Mason, in this interview. But first, I would just like to hear a little bit about you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. I'm originally from New Haven, but I've lived in Philadelphia for the past decade plus, and actually was living in Cincinnati briefly when I met Marius, who's my neighbor. We were not very close, but we traveled in the same social circles, like generally, like punk, DIY, vegan, and so forth. I worked at like the only vegan restaurant in Cincinnati at the time. And then I've been living here in Philadelphia, working for a domestic violence nonprofit, and more recently working at FDR Park.
Awesome. What was your journey into the activist world like? Did that spark because of Marius, or have you kind of been in the activist world since before that?
Before that, I think I went vegetarian when I was 12 years old, and I had a good friend who was vegan. And it was the first time I met animals actually in a sanctuary in Canada, specifically chimpanzees who had been used in animal testing. And that's sort of where I entered, I guess, the animal rights world. And I was a part of that, I guess, largely for my teens. And then around the time that Marius was arrested, and really around, I guess, the Shack 7 trials and Daniel McGowan and any number of political prisoners who were involved in eco and animal defense were being arrested and incarcerated, I became more involved in prison abolition. And I started corresponding with various prisoners who, did or did not identify as political. That's sort of where I've stuck to since.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that? Like at AAM, we stress it really heavily. There's so many different ways to be involved in activism, and I feel like there aren't enough people out there like supporting political prisoners and things like that. There's so many different ways to get involved. What kind of led you to the world of prisoner support, and can you explain to folks why it's so important to do this work?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm in my mid 30s, so I've been around a minute, and definitely in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of people who were doing eco and animal defense were being arrested. And there was a lot of, um, I mean, people are experiencing like conspiracy charges, or in the case of the Shack Seven, they were seeing charges that we had never seen before, like being charged with black faxing, all sorts of ways that the federal government generated um, means of criminalizing the movement, specifically the animal rights movement, and seeing companies who abuse or kill animals as beings unto themselves, that they have their own personhood, and that outweighs the life and lives of non-humans, and then also the people who value their lives, such as these activists. And so, yeah, I think that it was definitely the outrage of, right, when I was in my younger years, of caring about, generally just the world environmentally and animals, and then seeing the people who really went all out to, or in some cases, not even some people who just had their toes in the world of animal rights, being hit with really heavy charges, and facing intense jail time, and then eventually, right, being forced into getting federal crimes, and which federal crimes are some serious shit. So yeah, I think that outrage, seeing that happen, was really what transitioned for me. And then from there, it's just like, I guess like political prisoner, which is a term that I don't really identify with anymore, or I try not to use. It was kind of like the gateway drug to just overall prison abolition, because, I mean, it's been said time again that any prisoner is a political prisoner, by nature of what imprisonment in this world and this country specifically means. And I know that Marius would agree with that, especially since he's been incarcerated, and all the people he's met, and the stories he's heard, and how he identifies his life with theirs. Though Marius took actions on behalf of animals or on behalf of the environment, the people he has been incarcerated with are, their charges might be entirely different, but because of how we treat people in this country, specifically people of color, queer people, that their lives are politicized, and so they are facing incarceration just for who they are. And so that is really seeing the humanity of people who are incarcerated, realizing that the idea of there being sort of a criminal element, or, right in the 90s, we called them super predators, these different terms that were generated to dehumanize people who were facing charges or jail time, that they are in fact humans, and that they, for whatever reason, they're being targeted by the state. Angela Davis would say that prisons don't disappear problems, they disappear people. And that's exactly what happened to Marius, and that's what happens to everyone who's incarcerated in the United States.
Can you tell us a little bit about Marius? What are his interests? What is he like?
Yeah, so Marius grew up in Detroit, Michigan. So if you can imagine, there's a lot of dichotomies in his relationship to nature, but then also he is a strong advocate of the labor movement. So he was involved with the IWW for decades, as well as organizations like Earth First. And so really he straddles that line between, and he would call himself an anarchist, but he would see himself as sort of a syndicalist as well as a green anarchist. He cares about both elements. He doesn't see one as being more important or valid than the other. And then Marius sort of takes his political beliefs to every level of his life. So whether it be the fact that he is a parent of 2 children who are now adults, but how he raised them, also where he would eventually live in the world. He for a long time had a animal sanctuary, or it was really a cat sanctuary that I believe got into like upwards of 100 cats. And he let's see, but he also loves camping and hiking. He loves vegan food. He loves to talk to me on the phone about vegan food, about making it, what he can put together in his commissary or in the in the dining hall that can be vegan. He also loves, community gardening, any form of direct action that's community based. And so he loves gardening. Definitely for himself and then the community. He's been able to do some gardening while incarcerated. He definitely wants to talk about like invasive plants, the nitty gritty of anything that goes in the dirt or lives on top of it. So he has a wide, what I love about Marius, but also can be a little frustrating, is that Marius has such a wide net of interests that it's sometimes, especially with prisoners that we've politicized, oftentimes I don't want to say the word cater, but they sometimes are sort of like pigeonholed into one group, right? Like this is somebody who, let's say, was arrested in the late 60s, early 70s, and they were part of like the Black liberation movement. And so sometimes the only people who get support from are like the Black community or people who were living in that time and experienced that same type of oppression. With Marius, because he has so many interests and he cares about so many things, and he was so active in so many organizations and collectives, it means that his support is wide, but it can be also thin, unfortunately. And so it's been hard over the years to get momentum, get him to be sort of a household name because of that sort of thin but wide spread of support, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. So tell us about what led Marius to being arrested and eventually incarcerated. Just kind of give us that whole story if you could.
Yeah, okay. So between 1999 and 2000, Marius and a few other people, as part of a cell or collective, did a number of direct action actions that were on behalf of the animal and earth liberation fronts. So they claimed them. They issued a statement connecting these actions to the concepts behind those movements. And one of them, the most well-known would be the Michigan State University fire. So Marius on New Year's Eve came into a lab that was doing testing on genetically modified organisms. It was at a lab in a university, but it was in cooperation with like a GMO company. And so while it was being conducted by a professor, it had bigger implications. And like on an economic or, on an economic level, I suppose. And specifically how Marius saw it, or how, the wider understanding was that this is a time where we were really talking about globalization. And specifically in places like India, farmers are forced to use specifically GMO crops and seeds, which means that they do not have choices in terms of using their native seeds, their native crops, using their own machinery or their own land, how they would use it, and they really become into this bind with agricultural corporations in terms of what they can and cannot do. And this, people can look this up, that unfortunately this has resulted in a lot of suicide among farmers in places like India. And so this lab is specifically doing GMO research. I believe the plant was potatoes. And Marius and co. Entered the building and set fire to the lab. So they destroyed documents, computers, lab equipment, and they actually were able to render it inoperable. So the tests no longer went forward. There were, no other studies specifically of this going on from there. And so that, along with a few other things like the liberation of animals in fur farms and the destruction of logging equipment. Marius was eventually arrested in 2008. So that means from 1999 to 2000, he was not captured. It wasn't until 2008, when I myself lived in Cincinnati, that he was arrested on his way to work. And he was brought back to Michigan, which is where the original charges stemmed from. And he was put on house arrest, and he went through a trial in which he was given 22 years or 21 years and 10 months. He was given elevated terrorist charges. So again, like I said before, the US government in the last 20 odd years has been able to bring about these enhanced terrorism charges. And there's sort of a response to, or as a result of sort of 9/11 and this abundance of funding going to anti-terrorism in the United States, and the reality being that, right, that it just doesn't exist on that level, or it doesn't exist in the same, it just doesn't exist. And so, right, like we've seen since things have been disclosed, that, right, places like Brooklyn, where the FBI and police have, heavily concentrated millions of dollars in investigating like the Muslim community of Brooklyn, that there is no, terrorism going on, and that in fact that money was then had to be spent or used some way. And so, one can argue that it has spread into other forms of, I guess, social destruction, sort of like the animal liberation movement and earth liberation movement, right? And then, as we are here today in 2022, we then wonder, why wasn't this money moved into homemade terrorism, such as the white nationalist movement? But yeah, so that's sort of a long story of how Marius got arrested, or what his charges were. But he was, Marius did what would be called above and below ground activism for years. So above ground would mean that, like, participating in his local labor union, or doing community gardening, or doing some sort of like participating in his daycare with his kids, things like that. So above ground organizing that, fostered the change that he wanted to see in the world. And then below ground organizing would be the actions that he took in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the ones that he was subsequently charged with.
Yeah, thank you for all that. Yeah, I've spoken on this on previous episodes, but just, classifying someone who's 100% nonviolent is just, as a terrorist, is just so unbelievable. I was talking with someone else who did underground work that's out now, and he just said that being classified as a terrorist is just kind of so surreal. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, I think that probably you mentioned that, in the history of the ALF and ELF, not single, human or non-human has been harmed in any action to this day. And, we could say that back in 2008 when Marius was arrested. We can say that today. And now what? It's been going on 40 years. And yet, yes, the US government has been able to call them a terrorist group and one of the most serious terrorist groups in the United States. And yeah, it's truly disgusting. No, again, in Marius's case, all the cases that where he liberated animals, where he destroyed this lab and so forth, nobody was harmed. And yeah, nobody's been harmed physically. Financially is another question, but physically, nobody's been harmed.
Yeah. Why do you think Marius chose to take action in an illegal way for these different causes?
I think Marius is now in his early 60s and has been involved in various forms of organizing his entire life. And I think that there was a point where he realized, like so many, that there are no options. There is nothing that you can do. You can lobby, you can vote, you can organize above ground to some degree, but that saving lives, especially in the case of, let's say, animals that you're liberating from a fur farm, like that's it. You open that cage and that animal is free, and their life will not end. And it's as simple as that. I think that, for Marius, he did both, right? So like he did, performative nonviolent protests. He did, lobbying and voting and so forth and organizing around, politics as they're traditionally known, his entire life. And since the actions that he took, he also continued to do that above ground work. But I think that, realizing sort of the dire situation of our planet, and, the numberless, lives that are taken every day of animals, and then people who are, humans who are subject to that oppression as well. I think that Marius's feelings of overwhelm, boiled down to exactly this. He saw something could be done and he did it.
How did Marius get caught?
Marius got caught because one of the people who was in his collective, Frank Ambrose, was his husband. And he snitched on Marius and the other people who engaged in the actions. One thing that, we've also seen in the last few decades is people who under great pressure, or sometimes not even that great pressure, do turn to the government and say, hey, I'll give you names and information. And that was unfortunately the case for Marius, is that it's somebody who was, very near and dear to him, went to the feds and told them what they wanted to know.
I can't imagine the feeling of betrayal from something like that, especially your spouse. That's horrible. I don't even know what to say.
Yeah. I mean, Marius was on house arrest, right, in Michigan, and then during the trial, and he was allowed to come down to Cincinnati for 48 hours to pack up his things. So this was a home that he shared with his 16-year-old child at the time, and 5 cats, a dog, and an iguana. And I was there to help him pack up his house. And there were times where he would open up a chest of, things that he's held on to over the years. And there would be pictures of Frank, or, pictures of Frank with his kids, or, just things, all these memories. And then to have that all come crashing down on you when you're driving to work. It's truly horrible.
Has anybody that cooperated against Marius tried to continue with activism, like reintegrate into the community at all?
No, not that I'm aware of. No.
Um, Marius came out as a trans man while in prison in 2013. He was one of the first, if correct me if I'm wrong, one of the first, if not the first, trans man to receive transition-related health care in prison. What's it been like for him being incarcerated as a trans person and going through all of that?
Yeah, I think just to clarify, that would be federal prison. So it's what's unfortunate about the U.S. prison system is that, right, we have over 2 million people incarcerated, but that includes local county jails, state prisons, federal prison, people who are on probation, people in halfway houses. So there's any number of different things that are considered incarceration, and that I understand that 2.5 million does not even account for everyone who's incarcerated, but at least for the federal prison, yes, Marius was the first person in federal prison to get sort of gender affirming treatment. So he was on or continues to be on testosterone, and yes, it's been a mixed bag. I think that when Marius initially was incarcerated, he was at a small state prison called Waseca, and I think that was only for maybe less than a year. And then he moved to Fort Worth, Texas. It's FMC Carswell, and FMC is Federal Medical Center. So there's a series of federal prisons and slash hospitals in the United States. There's only a handful of them, and one women's federal facility is in Texas, and that's where Marius was sent to. Initially, the reason being that, or as we gathered, whether it was confirmed or not, is that there's a specific an administrative unit at Carswell. So there originally was the only women's death row was at Carswell, again on the federal level, and that unit became this administrative unit. So it's it's sort of like a prison within a prison within a prison, and Marius was sent there. As oftentimes it meant that he had little communication with the outside world. It was even more difficult to visit him. You had to get a series of approvals. And yeah, just various reasons that it seemed like his communication was being controlled by being on such a small unit. I think towards the end, when he left, it was maybe 12 people were on this unit. So it was easy to monitor them. And that's when he was at Carswell when he came out. I think with in part the hope that because he was in a medical facility that they would have more resources or be a little bit more responsive to his medical transition. That was not the case. It's sort of been back and forth in terms of he has to just continue to advocate for himself pretty much on a daily basis to get what he needs. And then he moved on up to Danbury, Connecticut. He's since moved from the women's facility to the men's facility only in the last year. And he in the men's facility, it's been pretty good actually, mostly okay. And I think he feels that he has more contact with medical than he previously did. But again, I mean, across the board, county, state, federal medical care in prisons is just, it's disgusting. So, what he's had to endure just for a toothache or, stomach pains is not what anybody should have to go through. And then on top of that, having, specific or special medical needs has just been, again, it has meant that he advocates for himself and sometimes for others on his unit every day.
Yeah, thanks for the insight on that. How long does Marius have left in his sentence, and how long has he served so far?
I should have looked this up. Like I try not to think about it, to be honest. How sad is that? But
Yeah.
So Marius was arrested in 2008. He was given 21 years and 10 months. Yeah, I mean, I think I would have to look back at an email from his lawyer to see one. I think he does have a specific release date now. So that's promising. But I think part of the reason why we don't think about his release date, Marius certainly does. And I think that keeps him alive. But for people on the outside who love him, I think it's difficult to think about because of his age, because of his medical needs, because of all he's gone through, this feeling of concern of him surviving prison and what kind of life he would be able to have outside of prison. Again, he's, he is going to owe $4 million due to his actions in the late 90s. And so it's just, and, on top of then having, federal convictions, it's going to be very difficult for him when he gets out. And so I think that's really why we just try to live day to day in the now, email by email, letter by letter, because it's hard to think about the future. It's also hard to think about the future when, right, Marius, the feds asked for a certain amount of time, and the judge on his case gave him even more than that. So, the suggestion was, X number of years, and the judge was like, nope, let's just add a few more. And that was completely the control of one individual, one judge, and something that Marius attempted to appeal and was unable to. And so, yeah, I think that somehow the bizarre nature of his case also makes it hard to think about how many years are left.
Yeah. My goodness. How are his spirits, like, day to day? Has he, I mean, I guess he's been in there for a long time. Has he, found ways to be happy?
Yeah. So I think that sadly, I don't really like saying it this way, but there's been little victories almost in the time that he's been incarcerated. So like the first unit he was on at Carswell at the administrative unit, the only outside time Marius got was in the yard, which was sort of my understanding was a like basketball court sized slab of concrete that had razor wire as fencing around it and razor wire over the top. And so Marius, quite literally could not see the open sky without prison being right there blocking it. And while, other things, like sometimes he would see deer out there, or the unit actually had a couple of stray cats that would come around, and to some degree the correctional officers would let the prisoners engage with the cats. For the most part, Marius, did not touch grass or trees for years and years. Then he was moved into general population where he was able to touch trees and grass, but it to some degree, like he couldn't kneel down and tie his own shoe without it being a problem. And then he's moved to Danbury, which I think is a little better in some ways. The fact that it has a more diverse climate. So, I think some people have maybe, if you pay attention to prison abolition, have paid attention to that. Basically, especially in places like Alabama, a lot of prisons do not have any kind of air conditioning or any climate control whatsoever, and so that could be difficult in Texas, where it'd be extremely hot. And then Now that he's in Connecticut, the weather's a little bit more mild. He has been able to do some gardening, collecting seeds and planting them for the next season and seeing them come up. He's been in an HVAC class for a while now. He did a paralegal course. So there's a little bit more programming options in Danbury. The entire time he's been incarcerated, he has tried his best to maintain writing, poetry, and making art. Marius also plays the guitar. He's had a number of classes that he's taught or done tutoring, like one-on-one on guitar or ukulele or any number of instruments that he can play. And then, yes, where he is currently, again, I think that he feels, again, similarly, he has the classes that he does. It's been difficult the last few years because, as some may know, because of COVID, many prisons have not allowed visitors at all. And that's really a lifeline for so many people who are incarcerated is visitors for many reasons, not just that, talking to somebody one-on-one, in person, but what it means and what it shows to other people on your block that, you're cared for, and that somebody's got your back on the outside, that can really change your position in prison. And so, unfortunately, I would normally visit Marius when he was in Texas once or twice a year. When he moved to Danbury, that's a lot closer for me. And so I was able to visit him like 4 times a year. But I have not been able to see him since March 2020. So, there'll be like windows where they'll let visitors in, but for people who are not in the general vicinity of Danbury, it's difficult to, you can't just like pop over and be like, visiting hours are finally open, but they're only open from 9 to 3, or the hours have changed, or the days have changed, or the rules have changed. And so for me, being 4 hours away, by the time we hear about the potential to visit him, it's usually already over. And so, communication in and outside of prison is very slow. I think that's been, I know that's been really tough on him. He has 2 kids. He has a sister that he's close with, and he has his friends. And so, the fact that none of us have been able to see him, and now, 2 years is, it's been really hard, but I think he finds a way. I think that receiving books, receiving letters, that is always helpful. I know talking to him, he does mention in every 15-minute call, what's going to happen when he gets out. So I think holding on to that is, it definitely lifts the spirits. And also, I think specifically, if anybody ever decides to reach out to Marius, is that Marius has been in so long that there's a lot of things in the world that have changed, that he's just not aware of. So like Marius has never held an iPhone. I've tried to describe Twitter to him, and he's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But while those things suck, there's other things that are kind of great. So like, I'll describe a gender affirming barbershop, where all of the barbers are trans men, and, they only take on, trans clientele, and they're all about making sure that you feel yourself, that you look like who you are. And things like that did not exist when he was incarcerated initially. And so, or didn't exist in a place where they would, get an article online that was circulated. And so, so things like that, I think about all the time how, Marius has not experienced all kinds of crazy vegan things, right? You go back to 2008 and think about silk, those were your options. Vegan ice cream, what is he eating? Cuties? That's disgusting. So I think that, thinking about things like that, he just has no idea how many milks are out there right now, and more milks to come, I'm sure. But I think that those things, talking about them is it's not something he's going to see on television. And that's really right now his only connection to the outside world is watching TV. And so, and it's whatever TV everybody on the unit agrees upon. So, while he has been able to listen to NPR to some degree and local public radio, he is pretty much subjected to, mass media news. And so, it's not something you really want to watch when you're incarcerated. And it's not really the best place to get information about anything enlightening or, wholesome or, just things that would matter to him, I guess, or who, like subculturally is relevant. So, I think that definitely those are the things that keep him going is knowing that there's just like this whole wild world out here and that, that we're like living large in the vegan world. And so, I think that's really where he's at right now.
Yeah. So I listened to some old podcasts where I think you and some other people came on to represent Marius. And I know previously, if people wanted to write to Marius, they had to like use his old name and things like that. Have things like that changed? It seems like they're recognizing his identity a little bit, by like putting him in the men's facility. So have things like that changed?
Yeah, so I think that we had our doubts on the outside for a long time that he would ever be moved into a men's facility, but he has been. And certainly now you can write Marius Mason on an envelope, and it will get to him. It still will like get to him as likely as any mail to a prisoner will get to him.
Right.
But it will get to him, unlike before when it was just like it would go into the ether and never appear again. So certainly there are things like that have been easier. I think that, certainly if somebody on the outside wants to talk about gender identity, that's certainly something Marius would love to converse about. It's his description of what it's like to be a trans man in a men's facility has been interesting in terms of like how he is gendered by other people on his block. And, like little things will happen that don't seem like a big deal, but then, will start shit that he just wasn't prepared for. But then, things sort of sizzle and he's back to where he was. So I think that, prison is just a really weird place. And so it's like in some ways he's safer on the inside than he is out here. In some ways he's not, right? I think, right, Marius specifically cited the reason why he came out in prison and not prior is because it was the first time he felt like he could be freely himself.
Wow.
He wasn't concerned about losing his kids in a custody battle. He wasn't concerned about, about, to some degree, he wasn't concerned about, maybe he should have been, about close friends or family rejecting him. And unfortunately, people did write to him and say, I don't acknowledge your transition, or somehow I take offense to it. But I think, in a lot of ways, it was freeing, I guess is the only word that I could use. And so, it's been a mixed bag.
What do you think are some of the main, like, key takeaways from Marius's case and just his experience? Like, what can activists learn from Marius?
A good question. I think that definitely close friends of his, again, because he has so many interests, we're all so across the board. Some people identify completely differently than others in terms of their political beliefs. But I think we've all sat with, would we do the same thing? And I think that, yeah, if you take a cost benefit analysis, that's really what it comes down to. I mean, for Marius, he did close that lab. That lab did not reopen. And that means something to him. Does the capitalist machine continue to grind? Yes. But did he offer some sort of relief out there for people who are harmed by the system? Maybe, yes. And so I think that, what I would hope is that we keep on going, right? Like there's been, especially not as much lately, but in the like animal rights and earth liberation movements, but definitely in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was so much crackdown. There was so much conspiracy and surveillance. It was such a scary time to even think that like you cared about the environment. But people, and a lot of people said like, I don't want to be arrested. I don't want to possibly face incarceration or torture. And I totally get that. I just hope that we continue on, using the best tactics that have the best results. And I think that's where Marius comes from. Marius said that like, yes, I understand that like, all of these things can add up to something, or this one action can really make a difference. And he was able to see it for what it was and step forward and do it. And so I think that like, yeah, it's just, you think about other more performative actions like protests or property destruction, where it's just like, what is the result? Yeah, I think that I just hope that people continue to think in that mindset. In terms of, again, like, right, so his case is so unusual. It's hard to say prepare for what the state throws at you, because certainly we didn't see it coming. But I think that, yeah, just knowing what they're capable of is also something to keep in mind. And again, Marius's actions happened in 1999, 2000. He wasn't caught until 2008. I don't know. I don't know. I think about the kid who punched Richie Spencer is still out there partying, and I hope that, that's forever. Yeah, you never know. It's the system. What they're capable of is not predictable in so many ways, but it is predictable in the sense that we care more than they do.
Yeah. What advice do you have for anybody who's interested in getting into the world of prisoner support?
That's a good question. I think that if you can start local, that's really where to go. So like I was a part of is an organization called Hearts on a Wire. It's a collective here in Philadelphia. And they support specifically trans prisoners in Pennsylvania, state prisons. And so I think it is a lot easier to wrap your mind out around, this person lived in the city that I live, and they've been incarcerated in the state that I live in. And so we still have something in common, but then also it's just easier to follow, like Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania, he passed a law about books to prisoners. And so it was easy enough to follow from the people on the inside and their experience, and then what we were seeing on the news, how to best, transition our tactics to continue to support people who are incarcerated. And so similarly with Marius is that if I see a headline that says like federal system is on lockdown, I know that's Marius as well. And so I think that can be helpful, is that sort of start in locally, even if it's somebody that is a friend of a friend, right? Marius is easy because we have so much in common. But, on the flip side, if you like, a little wild mystery, you can just, throw your name in a hat and find any thousands of prisoners in this country who want to communicate with someone. I think that also just like being honest with people who are incarcerated. If you say that you can do a letter a month, do a letter a month. You don't have to send them money. You don't have to support them in any other way but send them a letter. You just have to be, transparent and honest about what you can and cannot do, what you are capable of. And that's totally fine. I mean, any little thing means so much. Again, a letter is a lifeline for somebody who's incarcerated. They not only get that little piece of the outside world on the inside, but other people on their unit see that they're getting mail. Correctional officers see it that they're getting mail. Like, they actually come onto the unit in many prisons and announce, X, Y, and Z has mail today, and come get your mail. And people hear that, and they hear like, okay, somebody's looking out for that person on the outside. That person has somebody backing them up, and yeah, that they might, even be a person that they can reach out to try to find somebody on the outside to be a pen pal, or maybe they're trying to connect with somebody they've lost contact with on the outside. And oftentimes Marius, people he was on the unit with will come out and like message our Facebook or the website and say like, hey, I knew Marius on the unit, just like give him a, hey, what's up? Like, it was great knowing him, or whatever, or how can I be supportive? So I think that all of those things are great, I think. And then the last thing I would say is that, like, don't overthink it. Like, it's truly, I mean, I think I was 17 and I was horse funding with this one prisoner, and I think he was in for ELF charges. I can't remember, but he sent me like a weird drawing of his foot, and he was just like, you know what? Like, I didn't know what to write. It's kind of been a shit day, so this is my foot. And and so it's just like, it doesn't have to be this like crazy profound letter that you're writing. It doesn't have to have this most like amazing story or demonstrate you're the most I don't know, prolific writer or something. It just has to say like, hey, I'm thinking about you, and this is what I'm doing that likely this person does not have access to. And I'd like to hear from you. That's all your letter can say. It doesn't, again, it's really simple stuff. And it means so much. So yeah, I've done countless letter writing events where people sit there for the first time and think like, well, what do I write? It's like, I don't know what to say to this person. They're incarcerated. They've been in for 20 years, or, they are charged with, something really wild, or, they like grew up in, I don't know, California, but I live in New York and I just have no way of connecting to them. It's just like, they're just people too. And so I think that, just don't overthink it. Just think like, what if you were in their position? What would you want to hear? What would you want to get? Maybe it's a drawing of a foot. I don't know. But again, don't overthink it. Write people letters. It's like the least you can do. Postage is expensive more and more, but it's still not as expensive as so many other things. It really, again, it means so much to receive a letter from somebody on the outside, and it requires so little effort, like maybe the least amount of effort of anything I can think of in terms of organizing on behalf of a cause that you care about. So just go get a cute letter, and maybe, probably not a cute letter, honestly, because they usually just let you send in white envelopes. But you can do any stamps, and stamps are pretty cool. Sometimes they have fun ones. So get some fun stamps and write a letter to somebody who's incarcerated.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you how people can support Marius in a minute, but before we get to that, do you have just anything else you want to say about Marius or his case, or just any final thoughts on that?
I mean, I just so you know that Marius is maybe the kindest person I've ever known. I have known people who he's helped them through their divorce. I know people who he's helped them through losing a parent. He has helped me through a breakup or two. He's just the kindest person, and everything he does comes from a place of just of empathy and kindness. And it is truly heartbreaking that he's not outside here with us. Um, but I think that, yeah, he hasn't received a lot of kindness in his life. And I would love to see that change. And I think that for me, that's the number way of supporting him, is to just show him that kindness. And yeah, so I guess that's all I would have to say about Marius again, and that encompasses, everything he did on the outside, every action, every bit of organizing, his family, his friends, the music that he was a part of, all of it. So yeah, he's a great guy.
That was beautiful. Yeah. So how can people show Marius that kindness, and how can people support him?
Yeah, I think writing him a letter is a huge one. If you feel up to sending him a book, pretty much all of the topics I touched on in terms of nature and animals, um, camping and hiking, gardening. He loves bees. Just like pretty much you name it, Marius is probably into it. And I follow the whale sanctuary newsletter, and I send him just like I print out those emails and send them to him. He will read the most depressing whale story you've ever heard, but he'll call you and talk to you about it. I think that giving him hot takes is great. If you write to him and say, this is how I feel about this most recent event in the news, I think that's again, it's just not something that he's getting on the inside. I think that, right, like no matter how hard we try, we do sort of become sucked into a national narrative, and it's so difficult when that's your only source of information when you're incarcerated. And so, like, kind of helping him get out of that is really helpful. So if you do write him, if it's not about something, just fun, and then for some, he really does appreciate those hard conversations, even when I'll say to him like, dude, you're like incarcerated, this is really sad. He's like, no, like this is where, like, what I want to do, this is what I want to talk about.
Yeah.
So that's big, I think. And again, books the same way. So they don't have to be like fluff. They can be like, young adult novels if you want it to be. Marius would love it, but they can also be, tougher books about social issues. And then, certainly we take donations. All of his donations go to him. And so that means that, so like, again, Marius is vegan. So he's incarcerated and vegan, which is extremely difficult. And so he lives primarily on what he can scrounge up, but then also the commissary. So prisons and jails have sort of like a store where you can purchase things, and anything from like tampons to deodorant to peanut butter or whatever. And so I know that like that's where he gets all of his non-dairy milks, is from the commissary. And as you can imagine, the commissary is like 5 times more expensive than you would get on the outside. And so, everything that he purchases, it's a lot of money. He's also has to purchase postage, paper, envelopes, phone calls, video calls if he's able to do them. So, everything, prison is extremely expensive. So anything he pretty much does on the inside, he needs money for. So that's really where, when you're donating, that's all that it's going to. I mean, we operate, his support crew operates the website, basically on our own dime. We pretty much, everything is, when it comes down to it, we're able to front it. But in terms of his day-to-day survival, it really comes down to donations. And again, previously to COVID, those donations also went to things like us being able to go visit him. So if we had to rent a car, or if we had to get a hotel in the area, not so much now in Danbury, but definitely in Texas, because it was so remote. And then, or if his kids need to fly out to see him. So a lot of that money goes to just supporting people in supporting him. So it's like, making it as easy as possible for people to visit him is what we hope, what a lot of those funds go to as well, or at least did pre-pandemic.
Awesome. Well, Letha, thank you so much for coming on here and talking about all of this. I hope that people will support Marius in whatever way they can. I know that, most of our audience will probably agree that, Marius is a hero. He's helped, animals and fur farms and, help the environment, which also affects animals and affects all of us, of course. And, I'm so thankful you came on to, help people learn more about him and just raise more awareness. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anytime I get to talk about Marius is a great time.
I hope you all got as much out of that podcast episode as I did. Speaking with Letha was such an honor, and I'm so glad that she and others continue to support Marius. I hope that you will too. We've put all the information on how you can support Marius in the description of this podcast. Off the bat, you can go to supportmariusmason.org and you can donate there. The address where you can write Marius is also on the website, and we've got the Instagram and Twitter down in the description below as well. So be sure to follow those accounts for more updates on Marius. Thank you all so much for listening. We hope that you'll rate and review the podcast. It really helps others find it more easily. And the more people that find it, the more people can be inspired by activists interviewed on our show, such as Letha and, of course, Marius, and to turn that into actionable change for the animals. If you enjoy the Animal Liberation Hour and would like to support our work at Animal Activism Mentorship, please consider joining our Patreon for as little as $2 a month if you're able to do so. This goes such a long way in helping us produce this content and grow the animal rights movement through mentorship and empowerment. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship, where you can keep up with the podcast as well as everything AAM. One more reminder that you can sign up for a free mentor to help you with your activism at animalactivismmentorship.com. If you needed a sign that you should be an activist for animals, this is it. Remember that it will take all of us to achieve animal liberation, so stay focused, stay positive, be effective, and keep doing your part. Until next time.